Thank you, Prashanti, and welcome to everybody again. So now I'm getting into how I got roped into leading the session in the first place. And what I want to do today in this session now is just focus on two reports that we drafted for the Provincial Department of Environmental Affairs in the Western Cape, which provided recommendations for how they could grow two priority subsectors of the biodiversity economy in the Western Cape. But before I get into that, I wanted to provide a little bit of background on the Western Cape Biodiversity Economy Strategy. So I'm wanting to get through, provide a bit of background there around, around what are the drivers for the Provincial Biodiversity Economy Strategy, and then go into a little bit of the high-level overview of the provincial strategy, and then look at those two, at the EcoInvest Phase 3 project, which we delivered, which was around drafting those those reports on those two subsectors of the biodiversity economy, and looking at, and those were value-added industries from alien clearing biomass and carbon sequestration using spekboom. And then basically, I just want to give you a high-level overview of what those, what the content of those documents look like, because I imagine that there'll be value for a lot of other provinces to delve into each of those subsectors, priority subsectors, in a similar way, in order to understand how to nurture the growth of the entire value chain of those different subsectors. And then at the end, there are some common needs or recommendations that came out of both of those reports, which I think we may find become some common enablers that the sector as a whole can focus on in terms of growing the biodiversity economy strategy as a whole. All right. So this, I'm not going to go through all the detail here, but the purpose of this slide is just to show you the multilateral environmental agreements from an international point of view that relate to the drafting of the Provincial Biodiversity Economy Strategy, and obviously they're all have also been incorporated into the national strategy. And then, if you're looking at national policy drivers specifically, we've got a number of strategic documents that guide the National Biodiversity Economy Strategy and obviously also the provincial strategy. I think one of the key ones is the National Development Plan. Prashanti, I don't know if you think there's any particular driver of those from the list up there that's more important than any other from your perspective? No? All, yeah, so pretty much all of them have been a key shaper of the National Biodiversity Economy Strategy. So then there are a couple of specific national and provincial drivers. So the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, the National Biodiversity Economy Strategy, these are drivers of the Western Cape document, and the National Development Plan, which translated into the equivalent Western Cape document, which is called the One Cape 2040 plan. And then in the Western Cape, we have the policy framework of the Western Cape government, the broader policy framework, the Green Economy Strategy framework, which is probably the key document that's been a driver that the biodiversity economy strategy falls under in the province. And then the Western Cape EcoInvest project, which has been running quite a few years before the biodiversity economy strategy was drafted, and the drafting of the biodiversity economy strategy was phase 3 of this EcoInvest project. And then the provincial medium-term strategic framework, 2014 to 19, there's also a lot of alignment there. So I mentioned that the Green Economy Strategic Framework was a primary sort of shaper of the Provincial Biodiversity Economy Strategy, and it's mainly just through one of the 5 drivers was ecosystems. And in terms of ecosystems, there was a very direct overlap in terms of water and biodiversity conservation, the tourism component, and livelihood job opportunities created from better managed ecosystems. And there were a number of opportunities identified through the Green Economy Strategic Framework. It's around ecosystem management and restoration, biodiversity management, mariculture, tourism, sustainable harvesting, conservation education, and research and development. And some particular enablers were identified that also underpin the biodiversity economy strategy, and those are sort of financial mechanisms, rules and regulations, and the red tape removal, knowledge management, and capacity and capabilities and infrastructure in order to implement these plans. So then, so those are all that's all around the supporting framework for the Provincial Biodiversity Economy Strategy. To my best knowledge, the Western Cape is the only province that's currently has drafted a Provincial Biodiversity Economy Strategy. There are a couple of provinces that have that are in process or have declared their intention to do so. But basically, the provincial vision is that by 2040, biodiversity, the natural heritage and associated ecological infrastructure is valued, wisely used, conserved and restored, and thus deliver the ecosystem services that improve the quality of life of the people of the Western Cape province. There's an overarching 5-year goal of that by 2020, a biodiversity-based economy contributes to inclusive and sustainable livelihoods and development opportunities. And there's some very rough sort of headline indicators around job creation, economic expansion, and equity, but I think those need to be expanded and fleshed out quite a bit going forward. There are a couple of guiding principles that applied to the draft, to the provincial strategy that centered around socio-economic sustainability, ecosystems, that ecosystems have finite capacity, ecological resilience, fair and equitable benefits from biodiversity, the conservation of biodiversity and ecological infrastructure, the sustainable use of indigenous species, incentive-driven compliance, and ethical practice. And then the strategy puts forward some core objectives. The first one being that the biodiversity economy of the province grows by developing and unlocking the economic potential of the biodiversity sector value chains. And the second one is that stakeholders recognize and value the economic contribution of ecological services to the Western Cape development goals. And then underneath that, those sort of core objectives, there are 5 enabling objectives. The first one focusing around developing financial mechanisms. The second one around research and development, the role of research and development. The third one is around improving and sharing knowledge, or the knowledge base and sharing knowledge. And then enhancing institutional and human capacity. And the last one is around streamlined markets. So in the Western Cape strategy, as an output from the phase 2 of that Eco-Invest project initiative that I referred to earlier, 5 priority value chains or subsectors of the biodiversity economy were identified as priorities for rollout or development in the Western Cape. And those were sustainable financing of estuary management, the energy generation from invasive alien plant biomass, funding land restoration with spekboom using carbon credit trading, incentivizing fynbos restoration through the honeybush cultivation, and agroforestry. And then a further process of whittling those down in order to identify two value chains to focus on came to those 2 in bold, and it was slightly reworded to be value-added industries from invasive alien plant biomass and carbon sequestration using spekboom. And so these are the 2 reports that were drafted with the recommendations for how provincial government can support the sustainable growth of these two subsectors. And each of those reports contained a part A, which was basically a feasibility study, and the second part, which was the business plan, which laid down all the recommendations for what provincial government should be doing to stimulate growth. And so I'm sorry for all the detail on these slides, but I'm just going to highlight. I wanted to give you just an overview of what the contents are, and I'll just highlight a few key headings. And the first, so this is the feasibility report part of the biomass value chain. So we're looking at sort of the current status of the biomass sector in the Western Cape, looking at the geographic distribution of existing initiatives and where we've mapped biomass in the province, the potential growth of the biomass sector in the Western Cape, who are the stakeholders in the alien clearing sort of biomass sector, what current engagement exists in that sector, what do we understand about the value chain, including a SWOT analysis, and then employment and socioeconomic development. What do we understand about existing employment in that sector and the job creation potential, and then the impact on ecosystem restoration and biodiversity conservation. And I think that's the key thing that we always need to bring back in all of this biodiversity economy strategy, so it doesn't become too much about the economy and not enough about the biodiversity and the social upliftment components. So that was the sort of feasibility study, and then the business plan part of it had a sort of what can we do to stimulate sustainable growth in the sector, and stimulating effective engagement amongst stakeholders. How do we strengthen the individual components or steps in the value chain, and how do we enhance employment, and how do we enhance local socioeconomic development outcomes, and how do we enhance ecosystem restoration and biodiversity conservation outcomes. So obviously there's a lot of detail in the report which would not be appropriate to share in the short space of time. And these reports will be, the department is sitting on the last draft for a little bit, so they're not public yet, but they will be in time. But if you send me an email, I can request to distribute them as long as it's not for further open distribution. So one of the key aspects of this process was learning to understand the value chain, and there are various models that one can use for looking at value chains. But I think that's one of the key things that us greenie conservation types need to understand is more around, or learn about, is more the nitty-gritties of how do you stimulate a business sector. And so what we're trying to do now is we're trying to look at each component of the value chain, and in that report there were recommendations on each specific aspect of the value chain and how can the province support the effectiveness and the cost effectiveness of that step of the value chain, so that the subsector as a whole can grow sustainably. Okay, and then coming out of that, right at the end, there were a couple of summary recommendations for the alien clearing biomass, and they got grouped into sort of innovation and entrepreneurship, market and brand development around green products from alien clearing, and building institutional capital. And then underpinning all of that was a foundation of strategic coordination across the subsector. And that was common to both the recommendations for the alien clearing biomass sector, but also the carbon sequestration using spekboom sector. And so looking at innovative new replicable business models, that's very much in line with the kind of funding that TMF is providing us. developing local small-scale biomass supply chains, knowledge exchanges. So there's already a process on the go in the Western Cape to establish a community of practice of all the role players in the sector and how they can share information and knowledge and best practice and guidelines and help each other. Yeah, so I don't want to go. I'm not wanting to focus on the detail. I'm wanting to give you a helicopter view of the process that we went through, with the view of giving you some kind of framework if you want to do the same thing. Then this was looking at the spekboom report. So the feasibility part of that looked at carbon sequestration, which is quite a complex issue in its own right, and all the role players and what that entails, which is pretty complex. I partnered with Anthony Mills on this report, and he provided a lot of good insights, and so did a lot of other specialists who are a lot more involved in the spekboom sector than I am. And then we looked at the current status of carbon sequestration using spekboom in the Western Cape. Predominantly, the sector is sort of dominated by projects in the Eastern Cape currently, but there is quite a lot of potential in the Western Cape too. Looking at the geographic extent of areas suitable for spekboom restoration in the Western Cape, there are issues around survivorship when you're planting out spekboom for restoration. Often a lot of the little truncheons die off, and there's different ways of putting them on the ground, in the ground, clumping them, putting them in little basins that all influence survivorship, and there's a lot of ongoing experimentation there, which is quite interesting. Looking again at all the stakeholders in that space. What is the current engagement that's happening within the sector? Again, building that value chain and trying to understand the value chain, and the local socioeconomic development and job creation aspects, as well as the impact on ecosystem restoration and biodiversity conservation. So there was some similarities in the structure, but there were also some aspects that were unique to the subsector. And then in terms of the business plan, again, quite similar to the last one, what do we need to do to stimulate sustainable growth, effective engagement, then a big focus on the value chain, and enhancing socioeconomic development, and enhancing ecosystem restoration and biodiversity conservation. And again, that value chain model is very important, and I think it's something that we need to get better at. And then again, those recommendations related to each step of that value chain, and this is kind of the sort of supporting environment around the value chain, which is also important to take into consideration. So the specific recommendation, or the summary of recommendations coming out of that report, was primarily around directing further research, supporting new and existing projects, and building institutional capacity. This was the same, and this was the same as the previous summary recommendations. You can see, sort of, due to the technical nature of carbon sequestration and all of that, and the methodologies of doing restoration using spekboom becomes quite technical. So there's quite an important research component there. But yeah, the information portal, creating a community of practice for the subsector was also key to both components. So there are a couple of overlapping recommendations that focus on strategic coordination around stakeholder engagement nationally and provincially, community of practice with information sharing portals, research priorities, monitoring indices and tools, and geographic focus of the biodiversity economy, looking at the geographic focus of the biodiversity economy in terms of ecosystem goods and services, poverty and biodiversity. And then around institutional capacity, growing business skills amongst the greenies, looking at management systems, and creating linkages to related government departments, programs, and initiatives. and then having a value chain focus that's market-driven, and strengthens the individual steps of the value chain. And again, Sam's talk yesterday around the complex environment that we're operating in. This is new territory for us conservation types. I think there's an importance around short-term strategies and to test many small replicable business models, and having agile responses to economic drivers and new knowledge that emerges through the process.